Just quickly, the following content is intended for educational and commentary purposes only. The views that are expressed here are based on publicly available information. This is 100% my personal opinion. Fact check everything, and all quotations used come under fair use. I'm not making any definitive claims one way or another about any individuals. I'm only offering my own personal perspectives based on the publicly available material. So please use your own discernment as you watch. Hi, friends. If this is your first time here, welcome. I'm Shannon. I talk about healing, embodiment, and what it means to reclaim your body after CSA trauma. And I do that by sharing my own journey to repair my relationship with my body. Today, however, is going to be a little bit different. What I wanted to talk about instead is the Aubrey Marcus Radical Monogamy podcast episode situation. Making a reaction video wasn't really on my 2025 bingo card, but I guess here we are. And if you're not familiar with this situation, uh, don't worry. You're going to get plenty of context to be part of the conversation, and I do believe it's a worthwhile conversation. Also, what bothered me about this episode was the presence of Marc Gafni, who is a former rabbi with multiple sexual misconduct allegations against him. Two of those include minors. And as somebody who was groomed and harmed by an older boy, that really hit home for me. So this is the first of a 3-part series. And today we're going to explore the very pressing question, who the fuck is my rabbi? And look at the allegations and Gafni's background. In part 2, we're going to unpack Aubrey Marcus's continued support of Gafni, despite the allegations and the things we'll learn today. And then when we get to part 3, we're going to bring it all home by looking at the Radical Monogamy episode and, seeing what shows up there when we have this sort of full picture of what's been going on. My intention with this series is really sort of two things. It's very important to me to give a voice to the people who have been hurt, allegedly and or otherwise, and also to equip you with information so that you can make informed choices, about who to let into your intimate spaces, like your community or your family or your marriage. And that's really going to be our framework for today. This is not about throwing stones. It's just about learning how to care more deeply for ourselves and our loved ones and our communities. That being said, I will admit there are times that I get quite passionate about the subjects we're going to talk about. So I'm going to promise that I'm doing my best to remain as objective as I can. Okay, so how about some quick context before we dive in? If you're not familiar with Aubrey Marcus, he's a public figure in the spiritual community. I would say quite a big one, actually. He teaches divine union with his wife, Vailana, and he hosts a podcast, and he has other entrepreneurial pursuits. I think sort of gyms, supplements, health bro kind of stuff. And several weeks ago now, close to 2 months, he published an episode called Radical Monogamy. Actually, I tell a lie. It's not called Radical Monogamy. That's just how it's stuck in my brain because there was a massive response to this episode. And one of the things that really got to people was this phrase, radical monogamy. It received a lot of criticism in the backlash. So just know that when I say radical monogamy, that's not the name of the episode. That's just how my brain has decided to label it. But anyway, I digress. So in this episode, Aubrey is there with his wife, Vailana, to hard launch their new partner, or maybe more specifically, Aubrey's girlfriend, Alana. and reveal to the public that behind the scenes, they've been quietly opening their marriage, and that Aubrey would actually like both his wife and his girlfriend to have his children. And with that, I saw a feeling of betrayal, uh, because apparently, well, a feeling of betrayal from the public, because apparently Aubrey and Vailana publicly were sort of portraying themselves as very much monogamous, good model for sort of healthy spiritual monogamy. And that's why many people looked up to them. In the podcast episode, well, I'm sure that and other things, but that was a big part of it. And in the podcast episode, they revealed that actually they've never been monogamous, maybe monogamish. And Vailana even admits that she doesn't feel like she's ever had experience being in a monogamous relationship. And they also have present with them Marc Gafni, who was there with them uh, through all of this, navigating the complexities of going from, I guess, monogamish to what is essentially now poly. They worked with Aubrey's beloved spiritual leader or spiritual teacher, Marc Gafni. And I'll say here really quickly for transparency too, Aubrey is somebody who I've followed sort of peripherally for years. Years ago, I came across him as a sort of fitness entrepreneur guy who advocates for plant medicines. It was the plant medicines that kind of caught my attention. He's had some interesting podcast guests over the years, and just generally, he seemed to me to be, a nice guy, friendly guy, living his best life. You know, he was just kind of there doing his thing, and that was fine. And so that's why, honestly, I was pretty surprised by this whole situation. I mean, maybe not so much that he opened his marriage, that seems par for the course. And I'll say also, when it comes to opening your marriage, poly, whatever, quite honestly, I'm not making any judgments on it one way or the other. If you are consenting adults and you want to open your relationship, then to my mind, more love and more power to you. That's totally fine. Um, what caught me off guard about the episode, what was actually surprising, was that I feel like I saw a lot of manipulation and gaslighting. And of course, once I learned who Marc Gafni is, or what his reputation and his sort of, well, his reputation, maybe not his reputation, but once I learned a bit more about his background and what he's been accused of, I was very surprised to see that the Aubrey Constellation are working with him. And because I'll say that often through this series, the Aubrey Constellation, and what I mean by that is, when I say Aubrey Constellation, I'm referring to Aubrey, Vailana, and Alana, because this is what they call their relationship. They refer to themselves as being part of a constellation. So if I say that, I'm referring to the three of them. But anyway, so back to the point. While I was following this online, I noticed that because there was such a huge response to it, and what I noticed about that response is how thoughtful and sincere the comments were. Usually when people get mad about something, it's a red hot mess, but actually there was a lot of genuine concern, a lot of great critical feedback, very thoughtful. It's been a pretty significant moment, I think. And for one, I would say I, for one, am genuinely grateful for it. I really feel like I learned a lot from everybody. And in a strange way, I think Aubrey actually did what he set out to do. I think he helped a lot of people, just not in the way he intended, because it didn't work out so well for him, unfortunately. um, but what I did also happen to notice as I was sort of following along is that eventually comments mentioning Marc Gafni, they started to disappear. And even though Gafni was central to the conversation, at some point it seems like people just stopped talking about him. And that was and so for me, I found it very unsettling to realize that The silence in the comment section, it wasn't because people weren't interested anymore. They were, but anything referencing Marc Gafni was being swiftly deleted. And I know this because I had my own comments deleted. And when I saw that, it just, oh, it just felt really heavy and icky. And that's when I knew I wanted to say something about it, because at the end of the day, it's not really just about Marc Gafni, the spiritual leader, the authority figure who abuses their power. This, unfortunately, is a tale as old as time. What I wanted to speak to, and why I feel like this conversation really matters, is that, predators, they don't always look the way that we want them to. They aren't all, really obvious Richard Ramirez looking creeps. Some of them, maybe even many of them, are as charming and well loved as Bill Cosby. And that's also why they get protected. And this conversation matters because 59% of child and teen abusers are acquaintances. So people like coaches and babysitters and teachers and beloved spiritual leaders. Abuse overwhelmingly occurs inside of trusted relationships, often inside familiar environments like the home or community institutions. For adult women, 46% of reported assaults were at the hands of an acquaintance. For men, that number is 44. And so, with these statistics in mind, it feels like it's worth taking some time to ask a few questions about Gafni's presence here. What his role as, I don't know, marriage counselor, mentor, throuple advisor. I'm not sure what to call him in this situation. And I also feel like it's really worth asking or bringing some curiosity to, what is the Aubrey Constellation upholding by giving him a platform and by censoring conversations about someone like Marc Gafni. So what we're going to do is look at Gafni's background. Our focus is going to be on the allegations and victims' responses. As often as possible, I'm going to try to use their words, and I'm going to add source links in the show notes so that if there's anything that you want to go through and have a look at, or do your own deep dive, you should be able to do that relatively easily. Okie dokie. Who the fuck is my rabbi? Part 1. Marc Gafni. Oh, I will say really quickly too, if it looks like I'm reading, I absolutely am. I really wanted to, do as much justice to this as I possibly can. And as my gran would say, I'm prone to waffling. So I have my notes written up so that I can stay on point as much as possible. So it looks like I'm reading, I am. Anyway, Marc Gafni. He's a former rabbi with a doctorate in philosophy. He's now a New Age author, speaker, and also the co-founder for the Center for Integral Wisdom. According to his website, under the section Who is Marc Gafni, he's also the victim of a decades-long smear campaign by an unspecified group of people that may include one of his ex-wives, disgruntled former employees, and perhaps some people who are jealous of his work. Gafni began his spiritual career, actually as a promising young rabbi, but he was eventually outcast from the community when multiple women came forward accusing Gafni of sexual misconduct during his time teaching in Israel. He was forced to flee Tel Aviv back to the US, where he then shifted his spiritual lens towards the New Age community. In this time, his rabbinic ordinations from both Orthodox and renewal institutions have been publicly revoked, and a petition with nearly 4,000 signatures was used by spiritual leaders and former colleagues as a tool to protect others by, trying to raise awareness as to who Marc Gafni is, or who they believe Marc Gafni to be. And here's a little excerpt from that petition. He has abused his extraordinary intellectual gifts and charisma to harm many who came to him in search of spiritual guidance and teaching. He has used professional alliances to legitimize himself by association and thereby be able to continue creating more harm. As a result, Marc Gafni is neither trusted, respected, nor welcome to teach virtually anywhere in Judaism. When these allegations came out in Israel, allegedly he took ownership of them at first and even wrote an apology letter to the women. I haven't been able to find an exact number of women, but it seems like it was somewhere between 15 and 19 women who came forward. They were his students and colleagues, and he wrote a letter apologizing to them. He has since then rescinded that letter, claiming that it was written under duress and it was written by somebody else and he didn't actually mean it. He just did it because that was the advice that he got. He talks about it here on Dr. Phil.
So you write a letter essentially confessing to and apologizing for what you're being accused of.
It was written for me. I could barely write something in those 4 days, Phil.
Okay, let me look at some passages of this. You said, I want to say, I understand I have made grave mistakes. I made choices that clearly hurt people I love. I am infinitely saddened and profoundly sorry for the pain I have caused. I take full responsibility for all the pain I have inflicted. Clearly, all of this and more indicates that in these regards, I am sick. I need to acknowledge that sickness and to get help for it. That is what I am doing in this letter.
Through that time, again, he's pivoted to become a spiritual teacher in the New Age community, and at some point became the beloved teacher or mentor of Aubrey Marcus. I'm actually not sure when exactly they first encountered each other, but they have podcast episodes going back for at least the past 2 years. Including an episode in which Aubrey addresses why he chooses to work with Gafni despite all of the allegations, all of the smoke. For me, that episode is super fucking wild. But we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna circle back to that episode in the next part. So stay tuned for part 2. Let's take a look though at what exactly Gafni has been accused of, because there are quite a few allegations. You know, we have the 15 to 19 women who came forward. Let's just call it a handful of women who came forward in Israel. There are 2 women who claim that as teenagers they were assaulted by Gafni. Gafni's ex-wife, or one of his ex-wives, his third ex-wife, Haya, claims that he was psychologically and emotionally abusive. Former colleagues, people from his inner circle, Rabbi David Ingber, Sally Adnam Jones, Donna Zerner, they have also come forward with their own stories of manipulation and witnessing unethical behavior. The first stories, though, that we're going to hear about are the stories of Sarah Kabakov and Judy Mitzner. And these are the women who allege that they were assaulted as teenagers. Sarah Kabakov wrote a public statement that was published in the Forward in 2016, and it details her experience with Gafni when she met him at the age of 13. I'll say that Gafni, for him, it's always been important to clarify that she was actually 14. According to Sarah, though, she was 13 when it started and 14 before it ended. In her article, she describes that being introduced to Gafni through one of her sister's mates. He was 19 at the time, and he was also a rabbinical student. And I'm going to apologize in advance for my poor pronunciation. I looked the words up, but I feel like I'm still going to not do them justice. So I'm sorry. But back to Sarah's story, Sarah claims that he offered to tutor her in the Talmud, and from their first lesson, she felt something was off. There was a weird vibe. She couldn't quite make out what it was, but it didn't feel good. She says, being inexperienced with adult men, I didn't have a clue how to respond. And I think that's really interesting the way she frames that, because for a 13, 14-year-old, a 19-year-old is going to seem like an adult. From there, the grooming begins, and even before anything physical happens, she's warned that telling anybody about their friendship is going to be a bad look for her. Sarah claims that Gafni eventually asked her parents if it would be okay for him to sleep over at the house because there was a synagogue close by and he wanted to be able to, easily walk to the synagogue. And at this point in time, having no reason to doubt Gafni's intentions, Sarah's parents allow him to sleep in her brother's room. And this is how she claims that he gained access to her. In Sarah's own words, she says, "It was then that he started coming into my room after I had fallen asleep and waking me up. I remember clearly that when he tried to touch me, I pushed him away, repeatedly. I remember saying no over and over again. No one had talked to me about sexual abuse, but I remember knowing intuitively with every cell of my body that this was wrong." After these incidents allegedly occurred, when she woke up in the morning, she would find Gafni repenting for their sins, which to her was completely wild because she perceived the situation in a totally different way. She says, "I didn't pray or do shuva, but just stared at him in disbelief. He really believed that I was a partner in sin." The encounter with Gafni she talks about in her article wasn't just a physical violation. What she's also describing is spiritual abuse. She goes on to say, I could not feel connected to anyone or to my school or synagogue. The spiritual world of my earlier childhood had been taken from me. Shabbat was now connected to a nightmare. The concept of Shuva was forever corrupted for me. I began to see hypocrisy and absurdity in a world that I once innocently felt was home. I was no longer anchored. I think it's a pretty terrible thing to not only steal somebody's water, but to also poison the well. Makes the healing from that is so complex. And the grooming, the abuse of power, the delusion that they were in it together, and also the response from the adults in her life. I l- I found this article tough. There was a lot of really moving and heartbreaking things about it. And after the article was published, Gaffney actually refuted the allegations and wrote his own response. When I read it, actually, most of Gaffney's stuff, to me, I feel like what he says does in some way track with what Sarah alleges, because I find that whenever he's pushed to confront the accusations, his defense is always that there was love, as if that somehow justifies it or makes it a harmless mistake. Like, there's just a kind of like whoopsie daisy. He actually doesn't deny that the relationships happened. He just disputes the way it played out. And if we go back to Dr. Phil, we can see him doing that.
You have said, quote, she was 14 going on 35.
That's a complete distortion. I've said it's a complete distortion about 1,000 times.
And I never forced her.
And
Did
I'm
you
happy
say
to say it
that?
again. Right, that's completely taken out of context. So let me just say what happened.
But did you say that? Did you say she was 14 going on 35 and I never forced her? It was all above the waist.
What you just read from Sarah is absolutely categorically not true. I was madly in love with Sarah. Right, Sarah wrote me beautiful love letters at the time. Right, when we finished our relationship, she wrote me a beautiful love letter. Right, do I think the relationship was a mistake? Do I take responsibility for it? I 1,000% do.
However, here is what Sarah had to say about their relationship. Gaffney's use of the words romance and dating when describing our association leaves me speechless. Seriously, is it romantic when someone creeps into a girl's room at night? Is it romance when she says no unheeded while repeatedly pushing him away? Perhaps it is the selective memory or fantasy of a predator that he can spin this horrific scenario into a normal consenting relationship. Wendy Murphy is a litigator and adjunct professor of sexual violence law at New England Law in Boston. And she wrote an email to the forward. And in it, she says, 19-year-olds are not merely 5 years older the way a 50-year-old is merely 5 years younger than a 55-year-old. They are light years older than 14-year-olds in terms of maturity and sophistication. He nowhere acknowledges this important fact. She added, "This is why teenage girls comprise the largest groups of sexual assault victims, because they are by far the most vulnerable." Gafni's claim to innocence, or the thing that he often speaks about, which shows his innocence, is a polygraph test that he actually volunteered to take when all of this came out around 2016. The test was to verify that his relationships with the girls were consensual, both Sarah and Judy, and that Sarah had actually sent him a really beautiful love letter after they broke up, which proves that their relationship was consensual. But unfortunately, he doesn't have that letter, and Sarah says that it's because it's bullshit. There never was a letter. However, regardless of whether it did or did not exist, it's worth noting that polygraph tests are not generally admissible in most courts due to reliability concerns. Experts in trauma and abuse, they often point out that passing a polygraph test doesn't prove truthfulness, especially in cases like this when the test is taken decades later. And just to really underline this, in an article posted by the American Psychological Association, psychologist Leonard Sachs has argued the idea that we can detect a person's veracity by monitoring psychophysiological changes is more myth than reality. But not according to Gafni, who seems to bring this up in multiple conversations. This is why I wanted to underline it, because I've heard him mention it quite a lot. Actually, he's going to talk about it with Aubrey when we investigate, the podcast that they do together. So I just wanted to really bring that to the forefront. This all really gives me the impression that Gafni is trying to position himself as being the victim. He, for example, has claims that Sarah was poisoned against him over time, that it started as a loving relationship, but it came out 20 years later as something awful because it was part of a smear campaign, that's why it just sort of popped up out of the blue almost for him. But actually, it didn't come out of nowhere, at least not for Sarah, who tried repeatedly to tell an adult, what had happened to her while she was still a teenager. When she was finally able to tell her parents, as with many well-meaning parents, they didn't know what to do with the information or how to help her take action. So heartbreakingly, instead, she was asked, "How could you let this happen?" On Gafni's website, under again the Who's Marc Gafni section, his connection with Sarah is framed as a misunderstood teenage romance. And as I was diving into all of this, I noticed that Gafni seemed to be good at manipulating the facts and meaning of words. At least in my opinion, he seems to be great at sort of massaging things into the shape of what he wants them to be, which sort of subtly changes what the actual events were, or what the meaning of the words he's using actually are. And the language that he uses on his website when he's describing this relationship with Sarah, to me, I read it and I had the impression that, if I didn't know anything about this at all, I would read that and think that he and Sarah were on equal footing developmentally and emotionally. It kind of, to me, it read a bit like, oh, this is just, a 15 and a 16-year-old, who were in a very orthodox situation, so their relationship was misunderstood. But we know that actually it was a bit different than that. And what I would invite you to sit with is this. In your opinion, is it appropriate for a 19-year-old college student to be in a relationship with a high school freshman? And keep in mind that the power dynamic isn't just about age, because according to Sarah's account, Gafni was her spiritual tutor. She also refers to him as an adult. So again, we have this clue about how she sees him in this situation. So I guess it's up to you to make up your own mind how you feel about this first story. Now we'll move on to our next one. Judy Mitzner was 16 when she went to go stay with Gafni and his wife. At the time, he's 24 and he was also her youth leader. Judy saw Gafni and his wife as kind of surrogate parents. From what I understand, it seems like she was staying with them because she had a difficult situation at home. There was some trouble there, perhaps. And her claim is that Gafni got into bed with her without her consent. The first time she was able to get him out, and the second attempt that he made, he was successful. She also appears briefly on Dr. Phil to present her side of the story.
The first time that Mordecai was inappropriate, I was sleeping at the time in the basement bedroom. He walked into my bedroom and he just said to me, "You look like you needed a hug today." I was very taken aback by this because in the Orthodox Jewish community, women don't touch men until they're married at all. He reached around to hug me and he wound up on top of me because we were in the bed. And then he went under my nightgown and I said no, and I pushed him off. He jumped out of the bed and just kind of looked at me and said, "This never happened and it won't ever happen again." 2 days later, he appeared at my door again, but this time he was only in a robe. He got into bed with me, and I don't know exactly how we wound up both naked. He proceeded to have me touch him, and I'd never seen a man naked before in my life. I'd never touched anybody before like that. So it was a horrific experience.
As with Sarah, Judy's allegations, it didn't appear out of nowhere because she claims that she had also tried to speak with family after it happened. But in this case, no charges were filed because the appropriate action wasn't taken for Judy either. Gafni claims when it comes to Judy that it only happened once and there was no sex and Judy initiated it. His words are, "We made a one-time mistake, which I take full responsibility for. We fooled around for 20 minutes." And this is what I'm talking about when I say there is, I noticed that there's something fluid, I guess is the way to describe it about Gafni's language, because he says, I'm taking full responsibility for it. So it's sounding like he's doing the right thing, but he uses the word we, and the use of the word we is really, really revealing because Gafni is the adult, but it sounds like he's trying to share the blame with a 16-year-old by implying mutual responsibility, as if they were co-conspirators in this. We were in it together kind of thing. That's what that word "we" does. And it sort of nudges us away from the reality of the situation, which is that there was an adult in a position of power with a vulnerable teenager, a vulnerable minor. He also claims that she wrote a note to him asking him to leave his wife. He's not able to produce that note. Convenient? Is that convenient? Is that a pattern? Another note? I don't know. And Judy says that the note, she's publicly stated that no such note ever existed. At this point, again, I think it's worth taking a moment to just sit with both sides of the story and to find where you personally land. So one story that we have, or one side of the story we have, is a man fooling around with a vulnerable 16-year-old as a married 24-year-old man and her youth leader, versus the other side of the story, which is assaulting a vulnerable 16-year-old as a married man, as a married 24-year-old man and her youth leader. There was a response video that I saw to the Radical Monogamy podcast that I thought was brilliant, Priestess Peaches. Uh, Definitely go check out her responses. She did an amazing job with them. And there was one quote that I wanted to share because it really resonated when I was listening to it. I think she sums up really well um, this situation between Gafni and Judy when the 24-year-old Gafni and the 24-year-old Gafni and the 16-year-old Judy. She says, an empowered masculine man would never see a troubled teenage girl's advances towards him as a permission slip to act on his urges. He would feel protective of her, which I agree is true. It seems like that should have been the instinct to protect her rather than take advantage. When I was learning more about the context for Sarah and Judy's allegations, this quote actually brought me back to the Radical Monogamy podcast. And it made me really begin to wonder, what are Gaffney's true motivations in that context of the constellation? And I wonder, how was Aubrey's constellation introduced to Gaffney's background? Because you would think that the same instinct to protect Judy would come forward, that would be sort of immediate and intuitive. It also made me reflect on, but I guess not, maybe not, depending on how you're sold the story. Um, but what it also made me think about too is made me reflect on Aubrey and Vylana, and I began to wonder if that same instinct to protect could be missing in that situation also. Stepping back to Sarah and Judy's allegations, there's an important point here to explore, and that is, how do predators find their prey? The common link between these two young girls is their vulnerability. Sarah's mother had actually been diagnosed with cancer, and the family was consumed by it. So, understandably, their attention slipped and they trusted somebody that they shouldn't have. Judy was also in a vulnerable position. She was staying with Gaffney because there was difficulty at home. And this is what predators are looking for. They're looking for vulnerabilities. I'll say for all of the survivors that predators are absolutely not looking for somebody who is weak or asking for it. It's not your fault. You didn't deserve what happened, particularly when it comes to teens and children. They are looking for kids who are in a position that can be used to their advantage. It's not anything about your character, that invited this situation. And Sarah and Judy were both in vulnerable positions, just for different reasons. There's a defense of Gaffney that's used by Aubrey, and he says that Gaffney never got to have his day in court to prove himself innocent, and that's very unfair. But if we listen to the story of these two women, we can see that through basically no fault of their own, these young girls were unable to do anything about Gaffney while it was fresh. And unfortunately, that's not an uncommon thing to have happen. Young victims are too often let down by the adults in their lives who don't understand what the appropriate response is in these situations. And okay, look, I get that this must be devastating to hear from your child, but the fact is, when adults fail to take action and the responsibility falls to the children and the teens, who must then somehow process their trauma well enough to be able to act before the statute of limitations runs out, which is kind of unreasonable, especially if you look at the statistics on this. So, on average, it takes survivors 20 years to report their abuse. And I can say for myself that that was true. It wasn't until I was nearly 30 that I finally sought proper help and talked with a therapist. And it was like 2 days before my 30th birthday that I finally told my family what had happened. And that was over 20 years after the fact by that point in time. Um, Also, another statistic that I fall into is the 65% of childhood survivors that never report their abuse to police. Much like Judy and Sarah and myself, sometimes the opportunity just passes you by. Interestingly, when the case involves religious or spiritual abuse, the time increases to 30 or 40 years before a person is ready to speak. And I think if I did my math correctly, Sarah's public ownership of the abuse would have been roughly 30 years after the fact. Another interesting statistic, according to RAIN, 48% of victims were sleeping or performing another activity at home when the assault occurred. And by now, if this is not a wound that affects you, and I truly hope it's not, you might be asking yourself, well, bloody hell, why does it take so long for a victim to speak up? I mean, some time passing sounds reasonable, but decades, that's so much time, and I get it. I'm sure I would have absolutely the same questions. There is actually a variety of reasons why it takes victims so long to be able to speak up about what's happened to them. Probably one of the biggest things is fear of the consequences. Maybe they are still in contact with their abuser. Their abuser might be part of their family or their social group or their community. So they might fear retribution if they open up, or they might be afraid of being blamed, being judged, being shamed, being ostracized, um, being hurt, not being believed as well, that people are going to think that you're lying, that which is a horrible, horrible thing. They might delay reporting because of grooming and manipulation that causes a delayed understanding of the event. So it might not be until years after the fact that they begin to realize, hang on a minute, I wasn't consenting. I couldn't actually consent, and I didn't ask for these things to happen to me. It makes it very confusing. So that can take a while. And then again, you might have that realization, but you might jump right into that fear of the consequences if I stay. If I now that I realize, if I say something about it, you can then go through a period of time of thinking, this is not going to end well for me if I say something about it. Then there is also your physiology. So you might repress the events. There may be a lingering sense of something has happened, but maybe you can't recall exactly what that something is. Uh, and then it's not until years later that memories come back and things are confirmed for you. Our physiology is designed for survival. We have fight, flight, and freeze responses, and those don't necessarily switch off just because the thing has stopped, whatever the thing it may be. If it's spiritual or emotional or physical or sexual abuse, um, and that's also what can delay people reporting, is that fear is still really alive and it feels safer to say nothing than to say something. So it might take some time before you feel secure and stable enough to be able to handle looking at what has happened to you. There is oh, bloody hell. I was gonna have it handy to show you guys. Um, I'll just put a photo of it up, I guess. There's a really amazing workbook by a woman called Erica Shershin, and it's fantastic. If this unfortunately is a wound that applies to you, I found this to be really, really helpful. And in the workbook, she describes it this way: the human experience of trauma is not about the past. It's about a body that continues to behave and organize itself as if the experience is happening in the present moment. So again, this is why reporting can be delayed, because that feeling of fear, it's fresh, it's alive, it takes time to feel secure enough and have enough inner stability as well as external stability to feel like you can open up about these things. Even though this is a really scary subject, and I can understand that it would feel natural to want to start, contracting as a way to protect yourself and protect your loved ones, I do believe there is a lot of hope available, and that's also why I wanted to make this video series and have this conversation with you, because I truly believe that, having a greater understanding of how harm can be caused, and learning to not shy away from hard conversations and building confidence around holding good boundaries. These are all ways that we can learn how to take care of ourselves and the important people in our lives without succumbing to fear and paranoia, and still being able to live fully and with open hearts. Parents, if there are any watching, have a look in the show notes. I'm going to pop some things in there that can help you protect your kids, signs and things to look for. And we'll move on to our next story now. So, our next story involves Gafni's third wife, and I've only heard her name pronounced once, so I could be getting it wrong. And if I am, please absolutely correct me. Gafni's third wife, Haya, was about 23 when they were married. And she says in her video testimony that that their 6-year marriage looks like a fairy tale to others. She says, from the outside, her marriage to Gafni looked glamorous. They were pillars of the community, and for a time, it really seemed like a dream come true to her. Like the marriage was a dream come true because they had this rich spiritual life. They were leaders making an impact with their voice. But very quickly, for her, the fairy tale dissolved and turned into a performance. She was just trying to hide the emotional manipulation, the verbal abuse, and the infidelity she says was happening. Ahaya says, I existed to work for him, and failure to perform to his standards would result in these, bursts of rage and verbal abuse. But interestingly, she didn't go into this marriage ignorant of who Gafni was, because Gafni himself had told her what she could expect to hear about him. And she alleges that he told her there was a real sexual encounter with a minor and there had been ejaculation. And she says that, many people had actually tried to stop her from marrying him. And in hindsight, she wished that she had listened to them. But at the time, she was, 15 years younger than Gafni and just enamored by this spiritual world that he had opened up for her. And it seemed to her that he really wanted to repent, and she was sort of found that endearing. It was important to her. So she naively agrees to the marriage because she believed that her love would heal him, that her love was going to be able to fix him. And I mean, so many of us have been there before where a relationship looks a little bit patchy, but we go into it believing wholeheartedly that it's going to be okay. We're going to be the ones that will fix the other person and save them. But it doesn't always work out like that, and it seems like that was the case for Hyatt as well. This is a description of her marriage that she gives in an article for the Times of Israel. She says, but the more things grow, the more the work grows, the more his temper grows. He berates me daily. Whenever I neglect to tell people about his accomplishments, he accuses me of being unsupportive and selfish. I forget an email and he explodes into a rage, yelling relentlessly, shoving things. He pulled a chair out from under me. He rants until I crawl up into a small ball on the bed and weep. According to Haya, Gafni portrayed himself as a monogamous man, but the affairs actually started beginning about 2 years into the marriage, she thinks. There's an excerpt, there's a letter that she wrote to the women her former husband had affairs with, and here's something she says in it. He was your rabbi, a spiritual authority figure some 15 years your senior. You were his student. Did you know that educate and seduce have the same Latin root? He had a sacred duty to educate you, and instead he seduced you. There is something about her story that feels, when I listened to her story, there was something about it that actually felt really familiar. It reminded me a lot of the ways, it reminded me a lot of how I've heard Aubrey and Vailana, especially Vailana, describing the, sort of early stages of their marriage. And not because I want to, and I don't say that trying to compare anything that Aubrey's done to, potentially, allegedly, what Gafni maybe might have done. I bring it up because when I heard that, there was something there for me that I can't quite put my finger on. There's some overlap there that I just find it really curious. It makes me think about what it is that Aubrey and Gafni see in each other, or what attracts them to each other, or what similarities they have. Um, I don't know. I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's just something about that I find really curious and really interesting. That kind of, I mean, maybe it's just an odd coincidence. Maybe it's nothing at all, but there's something about those two, about that description, that my mind immediately went to, wow, this feels like how especially Vailana talks about the early stages of the marriage. And what I wanted to sort of maybe side quest a little bit into here is, since so much of this is happening in a spiritual context, I think before we get to our next stories, it's worth pausing to understand a little bit about what spiritual abuse is, and how to identify it and recognize it. So spiritual abuse, it is a little bit tough sometimes to recognize. However, it's typically defined as a person or group or organization that use faith, religion, or beliefs to exert control. Spiritual abuse can involve coercive control, fear, exploitation by another person in a spiritual context. And, that can include aspects of maybe verbal or emotional or, physical or even sexual abuse. And here are some signs to look out for spiritual abuse. So, what often happens when it's present, there is a special language that only insiders can recognize, that sort of keeps you all together and on the inside of something. Generally, the leader, authority figure in that situation is speaking for God or has a special connection to God. There is coercive control. That is something that I would really encourage you to Google and look up. Particularly, Dr. Ramani has amazing videos about coercive control, and they can help you learn more about it. You're looking for things like, when it comes to spiritual abuse, you're looking for things like subtle invalidation of your thoughts and of your feelings. You have to look at what serves the mission or God or the higher purpose. You're getting too caught up in your feelings, or you're overthinking it. Basically override those to get back to the place where you can serve the mission. There is this us versus them mentality as well. That can be subtle or it can be blatant. The sort of subtle us versus them that I'm personally very familiar with is especially in the New Age community, is we are the high vibe, conscious, awake, enlightened, evolving beings, and they are the low vibration, asleep, sheep, living in the matrix people, kind of thing. You'll also notice with spiritual abuse that the leader, authority figure, or the people in the community, there's a lot of twisting of spiritual teachings or cherry picking of spiritual teachings. Often there is often what also happens, depending on the construct and the situation, unity can be pushed as a means of control. So it's pushed under the guise of creating harmony or expansive love, that we all love each other, we're all united, this is a special thing. There's a lot of also discrediting your personal experiences. So, for example, this is not your body, this is just a temporary vessel. So even if your body is suffering, it's not being affected by your higher self, is not being affected by what's happening, which is really, this discrediting personal experiences. It's really it's gaslighting, basically, being very dismissive of what you're going through, particularly if you're suffering. Love bombing, intermittent reinforcement, love bombing and then intermittent reinforcement, usually. Definitely look up both of those terms to get a deeper meaning. I'd love to talk about everything, but this will take 10 hours if I do that. And another big sign is that you can't talk to people outside of the group. Again, this can be subtle or it can be more in your face. It might be subtle in the sense of like you could talk to them, but your therapist, your friends, your family. But let's be real, they're not going to understand. And they won't get it. They don't get it. Those type of people don't get it. Only we really understand you. Or it's very straightforward in your face of you are not allowed to talk to anybody but us because we are the people that understand. Another sign or symptom, I guess, is that the teacher or the leader is clear. This is a person who knows. They just know. And there's a real hierarchy of insights because their insights are always more special. Their insights are always more insightful than anybody else's. And then one of the major signs is the thing you are serving becomes more important than the people that it's meant to serve. And that's where real harm can occur because when you are because your suffering becomes irrelevant because this thing is this abstract, symbolic, metaphoric, whatever it is, metaphysical thing is more important than you. So you just got to suck it up or get with it or push through, overcome. And even though that thing that you're trying to serve is supposed to be serving you, and there's not really an invitation to ask, hang on a minute, am I burning out? Is this actually serving me? It's just this thing is more important than you are. Okie dokie. Now that we've taken a look at some signs of spiritual abuse, let's go into our final stories before we start closing out this first part of the series. So the stories that we're going to listen to, one of them comes from an anonymous woman who was a former lover of Gafni's, and the other is from Donna Zerner, and she was in Gafni's inner circle. We're going to check out Donna Zerner first, and she first is opening up about her relationship and her experience with Gafni. She did this as a way of healing through that from that experience that she had with him because there is so much secrecy. So being able to use your voice is a really powerful thing.
I was in my early 40s, living in Boulder, Colorado, editing spiritual and self-help books and wanting to make a difference in the world. And that's when I met a rabbi and best-selling author who I'm going to call by the name Marc Gafni. That is not his real name. Mike was incredible. He was like brilliant mind like no one had ever seen before. He was really handsome and sexy, well, for a rabbi. And he oozed charisma. Editing Mike's book, which was about Eros, and then we actually became friends. I remember the first time he stayed at my house. He was in town for a conference, and we were sitting in my guest room, and I was telling him, he was asking me about my last relationship, and I was telling him about how horrible it was and how I was feeling really undesirable and not good about myself at all. And I looked over, and he had a tear running down his cheek. And he said, "Donna, I think you're incredible." And he took my hand and he said, "Can I show you how sexy you are?" OMG. One morning I woke up and turned on the computer and I found this website that was saying that Marc Gafni, decades before, had molested teenage girls, including a 13-year-old. This was bad. I was devastated. But Mike was all like, Donna, don't be naive. You have to understand there are people who are jealous of my success and they're trying to bring me down. It didn't happen like they're saying. And he spent hours and hours explaining what really happened with the girls and how the 13-year-old was actually 14 going on 35 and they were in love and it was totally consensual. And he just went on and on and on. He was so sincere and he looked me in the eye and he swore on a Bible and he just bombarded me and I didn't know what to believe. I had no way of connecting with these nameless girls and finding out their side. And finally I just thought, you know what? Why should the world be deprived of this man's brilliance and his profound teachings just because of something that may or may not have happened 25 years ago? Was changing the world. Therefore, I was changing the world. It was really thrilling. But as time went on, I had to work harder to kind of compartmentalize other things that were going on. Like, for instance, it became clear that Mike was actually addicted to sex and intense, but I didn't know, how do you say no to Mike Rock Me? I didn't know how. I desperately needed to process what was going on, but he had sworn me to secrecy. He said, if anyone finds out about us, it will destroy me and the movement, and it'll be your fault. So I couldn't tell anyone. I was holding 1,000 dark secrets, and I was feeling more and more isolated. I can fix him. I'll be the one to change him. So, I would try, and sometimes I would say, Mike, maybe part of why all this scandal and everything is happening is because, maybe you just need to take a little more responsibility around this. And he would just blow up at me, and he would say, you just don't get it. This is my fucking life on the line. And then he would go on and on, until I would end up being the one feeling totally ashamed. And then the next day he would call up and say, Donna, you're my best friend in the whole world. You're the only person I could trust. I need you. I love you. It was totally crazy making. One day, about 3 years after I first met Mike, I got a call from his assistant at his organization. She was crying, and she told me that several women had started talking, and it turns out that Mike had been sleeping with and sexually abusing students and women on his staff. I was totally shocked and not surprised at all at the same time. The organization and movement that so many of us had worked so hard to support totally crumbled. This finally, though, was my way out, and I cut off all contact with Mike. Yeah. And that's when my head started to clear. The veil started to fall away, and I could start to look back and realize all the ways that I allowed myself to be used by him. All the ways, all the times that I had ignored my intuition. All the times that I had betrayed my own integrity. I did it again and again and again. I felt so much shame. And then I started talking to some of the other women that he'd been involved with, had been sworn to secrecy. We had all been silenced in some way, but now we were talking, we were telling the truth, and it felt so good. We connected with each other, we exposed so many lies. There were so many lies, and so many of the women had gone through really, really severe trauma. But we helped each other, and we befriended each other, and it was so beautiful, the healing that came out of these amazing connections. And I thought, you know what? This right here, these connections, this is the real divine feminine.
Our next story is from a woman who alleges that nothing happened between her and Gafni until she was 23 and a consenting adult, but she was first contacted by Gafni when she was 14, and he was also married at the time. So what I'm going to do with this story is I'm just going to use her own words. She wrote a really in-depth article. I'm just going to pull segments from that so we can follow her story and sort of hear what a relationship with Gafni is like in the words of a woman who's been there, allegedly. So this starts with her meeting him at the age of 14. It was a brief meeting that I might have just forgotten about if he hadn't called me afterwards. Come to think of it, I didn't usually get calls from grown men. We didn't speak often in the intervening years, but now and then I would hear from him. He would tell me that I had a friend in the world. At 23, I arrived in Jerusalem with a plan to spend the summer studying the Torah and then find a job. He was the first person I called. Protecting himself preemptively, he told me before anything began that it was my responsibility. I accepted. I was loyal to him. At his insistence, I promised not to tell my future husband, my therapist, my family, or my friends. He would call and ask me how long we had been friends. After years of hearing this question and understanding that he was calling upon my continued loyalty to him, I once pointedly answered him since I was 14. He responded to the subtext beneath my words. I don't really remember you from back then, he answered, quickly erasing years of closeness that did not include sexual expression in an effort to make what was unseemly appear acceptable. I never imagined that he was in love with me, but I had thought he loved me, that a man of his stature who had known me since I was 14 years old, a man who I thought of as holy, was okay with treating me worse than I would allow any other person in my life to treat me. The incongruity of it suddenly became apparent. After years of lying about the allegations that he had had a sexual encounter with a 16-year-old girl while in his 20s and already a rabbi, her rabbi, he finally admitted that it had happened. It was 20 minutes out of her life and it ruined mine, he said, his voice dripping with malice. He called me in a panic when he arrived back in Israel in 2006 to charges that were filed in his absence and again after he fled back to the States. It seemed for a moment that he would examine the role he played in hurting so many people. Very soon, however, they started to sound like the calls of a narcissist engaged in using his quiet time to build a case against the women who claimed he hurt them. Using the internet, I was able to get in touch with one of these women. I spent the better part of the day talking with her, talking, processing, experiencing revelations. It was a day of healing. And going back in time, I have been reminded of the love that I felt for him and the person that I thought he was. On the one hand, I'm embarrassed by my naivety, and on the other, I feel an unexpected panic rising that it could be devastating a good man who was my friend. I know he will see this article as a betrayal of the worst kind. I also know that I and all of the women and men who trusted him are the ones who have actually been betrayed. So I write for them, but I also write for me. I write because freedom is glorious, and being freed from the grip of this enforced silence is liberating. Speaking out when you've been hurt is no small thing. It takes immense courage to risk the blame, judgment, criticism, shame, rejection, retribution. The voices of the women who spoke about their experiences are thoughtful and strong and clear in their message. They want to protect other women from having to go through something like what they had experienced. It also makes me think of the tidal wave of responses that came to from the Radical Monogamy podcast. You know, just so many men and women who were sharing their own stories of, you know, manipulation and spiritual bypassing and their experiences with, you know, toxic or unhealthy relationship dynamics. There was a lot of, you know, courage and openness and vulnerability there. There's a growing clarity, I think, in the happening in the collective. You know, there's something sort of powerful and inspiring, you know, about the shift that seems to be occurring. It's like the veil is slipping and we're beginning to have stronger boundaries and practice deeper discernment and basically just say no more bullshit. No more bullshit. And not because it's about, you know, dividing or condemning. It's just really about living more in alignment with your own values and being able to, you know, really fiercely care for the things that matter, you know, coming back to the things that are important to you. And something that I really believe is that there's only so much healing that we can do on our own, and then the rest we need to do with other people. And that's what makes our communities so important and such an integral part of life, and really why I believe we need to protect their integrity. My hope is that you feel seen and you feel heard, and that you are able to find your people, or that you already have some really good people around you. If you're watching this and you're in a crisis, you know, please reach out to a professional for help. In our next chapter, moving on from our origin story, we're going to be unpacking the Healing the Wounds of Culture podcast to understand a little bit better why Aubrey chooses to work with Gafni despite everything we've heard today. And then when we get to the third part of the series, which is going to look at the Radical Monogamy podcast, we're going to see how some of these ideas play out in practice, which is quite interesting, I think. So I guess I will see you in the next chapter. If you've gotten this far, thank you so much for your time and your presence and your company. I really do appreciate it. And I also value your thoughts and your input. So absolutely drop comments into the chat. Please let me know what I pronounced terribly as well, or what you think I may have gotten wrong, what your own insights are, what did you notice along the way. Please keep it respectful. Treat each other with dignity and with kindness. My hope is to build a space that is supportive of each other so we learn how to take care of each other better rather than how to just tear each other down. Hopefully we'll see each other in the next chapter. For me, the next one is so fucking wild. So I guess I guess catch you then. Like, subscribe, and say hi in the comments.